Yeah, look, presentation anyway is basically heart rate based zonal training. I'll send out the slides afterwards if people, if people are wondering. The talk's hopefully only going to be 40 minutes, but in terms of the detail that we're going into, it's kind of broad in a lot of it, but if you want to ask questions about certain aspects of it, I'm happy to go into as much detail as you want to go into. I've tried to make it a bit general, so just based on the kind of people that wanted to attend it, I didn't want to make it too technical. So I'm not going to talk too much about myself before I start. If you want to know any information, look, it's there on the website, kcperformance.ie. Start off with just the aims of the presentation. The aims of the presentation are basically identify where proposed zones occur, create an understanding of what happens at these zones during exercise, and ultimately, I suppose I want to create a conversation. I'm not here to tell you this is exactly right or accurate.
The Xiaomi Redmi 8 is 125
Somebody's got
on ecocentral.eu.
At me, we can hear you, Pat.
You want that?
Oh, sorry, Ryan.
No, I'll go. And he's doing zonal training, zonal heart rate training.
Lads, where was that there? If you've come in late, lads, I can't control the mute, so can you just mute yourselves? That'd be perfect. Cheers. Yeah, so look, I want to create a conversation. I'm not here to tell you exactly what's going on, or just basing it off predominantly my own research and things like that. And as I said, look, some of the terms are quite broad, and if you want to go into more detail, depending on the questions you want to ask, that's fine too. I have no issues with that whatsoever. Okay. So to start off with, I suppose zonal training has become a thing because everyone's got smartwatches. Obviously, people are now going training and they're being told their heart rate's at a certain level, and you've got green zones and orange zones and all these different zones, and people are trying to hit red zone predominantly for reasons unknown to them. So based on the questions I'm getting asked, number one, I suppose, is do I think that they are reliable? No, I don't think they're as reliable or as valid as, let's say, your VO2 max test. I think that will always be the gold standard. If you are going to take it seriously, I would recommend a heart rate strap, so the one that goes across the chest, because the watches aren't shown to be very reliable. In fairness, though, the Apple Watch has been shown to be the most reliable, but they're all somewhat out. And in terms of calorie predictions and stuff like that, they're all out. So that's not even up for debate. They're not very reliable for that. But if you were to get a true representation of where your heart rate is, I would recommend a chest strap, because that's what I use with my teams. We use live heart rate monitoring. We use chest straps. Look, the watches, they give you something. Sometimes they're reliably unreliable, but for the most part, I wouldn't be taking them as gold standard. And I don't think they'll ever replace the VO2 max test for predicting of what we're going to talk about in this presentation. This is pretty much what it spits out. So what is zonal based training? Well, this is Garmin's representation. So you get a red zone, an orange zone, a green, a blue, and a gray zone. This is actually an endurance athlete that I'm working with. So this is one of her particular sessions, and this is one of the lads in the team sport that I'm working with for hurling. So predominantly in hurling, you're kind of going to surf the zones. You're not going to always be in the maybe one or the other. You're kind of going to go in and out depending on the game, depending on the drill, depending on the training session. So an endurance athlete might go out and target a specific zone at a specific pace for a particular purpose, whereas team sport athletes are a bit more mixed. Unless now you're in off-season, pre-season, or you want to do extra sessions. But again, we'll cover that as we go. I've always looked, I suppose, look, the heart is the engine, and the heart rate monitors, they're not the speedometers, they're the rev counters. So you might have somebody who has their heart rate in the red zone, and the watch will show that, but that's obviously not an indicator of the speed they're going at. That's an indicator of how hard the engine is working, which is pretty much what the rev counter does as well. So you could, again, have two athletes going at the same speed, but one person's rev counter might be a lot higher than another person's rev counter, depending on their fitness levels. So that's the way I would look at it and say, okay, well, it's not really an indicator of how difficult the session is overall. It's just how difficult the session is for one particular person. Okay, so here we have two lads, two hurlers with Blackrock. They did the exact same session. So the session was about an hour long. So this is the warm up here at the start. And as they went through, then they went into kind of a warm up drill. It's quite a high intense warm up drill. And then at the end, when the session was all done over the hour, one fella spent a lot of time in the red and the other spent less time in the red. And I suppose the big question for me anyway, and for the particular athletes involved, was why the difference, and what decides why one person is in the red for so long over another, and why is this individual down so low in the green and the blues, and this fella is kind of cruising around on the greys. Hopefully we'll address that in this presentation. Okay, so again, just to emphasize that when you're doing a test, if you are doing a test, the best time to do a test to get somebody's true 1 rep or true heart max, so their max heart rate, it's best to do it during a fitness test or the gold standard, which would be the VO2 max test. Not everyone's going to have the same. So again, looking at the two lads, one fella's max heart rate is 169, the other is 188. And that's going to have an indicator, obviously, of when the zones are going to be, when he's going to be in the zone. So if, for example, we put in 220 minus his age and this particular athlete is 20, and you get, okay, his max heart rate is 200. So you type in that his max heart rate is 200, he's going to spend, when you look at the sessions, he's going to spend a lot less time in the red than maybe he actually does spend. So it's important to get that right. And it's going to be different for each individual. So when you're doing all these zonal testing, make sure that it's probably going to do a 220 minus your age formula, because that's kind of the common one to go to. But I found when we do fitness tests with the lads that there's such a variance in how much the lads can get their heart rates to go up, that we've just customized all the heart rate monitors to each individual's max that they achieved in their fitness test. To talk about the specific heart rate zones, look, if you look up the science, specifically HIT science here with Matt McShay and Paul Larson, they go into a bit more detail in terms of their interpretations of what the zones are. So you obviously zone 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They kind of go up in increments of about 5 to 6%. And there's lactate levels here that we might touch on as well as we go. This particular paper here done by Shane Malone looked at small-sided games versus continuous training. He identified different zones. So again, zone 1 was below 80. Zone 1 here was 60 to 72, but zone 2 was 72 to 82. So everyone's interpretation of what the zones are depends on, I suppose, the papers they've read and things like that. But I didn't really want to go into too much detail about it, so I've just focused on what the software gives out in terms of, again, Garmin and Fitbit and all these ones. So they look at a 10% difference. So they'd say zone 5 is 100 to 90, zone 4 is 90 to 80, zone 3 80 to 70, zone 2 70 to 60, zone 1 is 60% and below. Okay, we're only going to kind of talk about these three because they're the ones that people seem to target when they go out training. The others, while they are beneficial, these ones are the kind of the ones that at least people get to if they're going to do any sort of high intensity exercise or medium intensity exercise. Because the other ones, if you go for a fast walk, you'll probably hit zone 1 and 2 easily enough, but you're not going to say, unless you have a very unfit individual, that it's going to have a huge difference on their fitness. To go on, I suppose, look, instead of thinking of them as zone 5, 100 to 90%, I would look at it and say zone 5 would be time spent at VO2, zone 4 would be anaerobic threshold, and zone 3 would be aerobic threshold. So rather than just having an arbitrary number to say, oh yeah, 100 to 90 is zone 5 and blah, 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 we're going to talk about, well, what is 100 to 90, what happens at these zones, and we'll go from there. So zone 5, training protocols elicit a high percentage of VO2 max, maximally stress the oxygen transport and utilization systems, and may therefore provide the most effective stimulus for enhancing VO2 max. So basically when they looked at doing interval training and HIIT training, and I suppose if you went out onto a particular hurling or football session, you might just see lads being ran into the ground, because obviously if we spend a lot of time in the red zone, we are going to get fitter. And to an extent that's true, but it depends on the athlete that you have in front of you. So if you have a very fit athlete, we know VO2 max has a ceiling. So is there a huge amount of merit in just running them into the ground every second day or every day? I'm not so sure. And also, if you have somebody who's very unfit, is there a need to put them into the red zone for so long and so often in order to improve their fitness? Do they have to go in there? Because obviously the risk of injury and poor recovery and stuff may not be worth it. The other one then, I suppose the famous study with famous 20 on, 10 off with HIIT training, Tabata. So high intensity intermittent training may improve both anaerobic and aerobic energy supply system. So obviously you're kind of drowning the system in oxygen, and you're stressing the body so it takes in as much oxygen as it can take in, and then obviously it hopefully adapt for the next session. Why zone 5? So like I said, increase VO2 max. So studies show that if you spend a lot of time in zone 5, you'll increase VO2 max. But again, as I said, this is a ceiling. It's not the be all and end all. People like Steve Magnus and stuff like that would talk about that and say, look, people are emphasizing trying to improve people's VO2 max too much. And to an extent, I'd agree with it, because you'd have, let's say, an individual, we do fitness tests with our teams, they might get to a certain target number. Other people might push that number and say, okay, if we can get you past this level, you're going to be a better player. And that's not always necessarily the case. They only have to be fit enough to play the game, and maybe pushing them further, because you obviously have to increase their time in the red zone, and you have to increase their high intensity speeds. That recovery mightn't be the best, so it's a higher risk injury. So is it worth it if you have a very fit athlete to try and say, okay, what kind of game are we playing? Excuse me. Do we need to just constantly push this envelope? Are we really getting as much as we used to get out of it? I suppose if you look at endurance athletes, most of their time is not spent in zone 5. Very little of their time actually is. But these are the fellas and people that are targeted as being extremely fit. But if you looked at their training protocols, they don't actually spend a lot of time in zone 5. Whereas everyone who's trying to get fit spends ages in zone 5 and can't figure out why they may have not gotten as fit as they thought they might do. Increased buffering capacity. So obviously, excuse me, when you get into zone 5, you're increasing acid levels in the muscle, which is going to impair contraction. So by, again, exposing the body to this, you increase buffering capacity. So the body gets used to clearing acid, hydrogen ions and stuff like that to, again, adapt and become fitter. Exposing athletes to max intensities, that's probably the main reason people do it. They think if they get lads into zone 5 that they'll get automatically fitter and teams won't be able to go to that zone that every other team goes to and things like that. It's probably the main talking point about why you do puke sessions and all these kind of things, and why everyone thinks that I have to really push myself really hard in order to get fit, and that's not necessarily the case. What I would look at is, from certainly a professional standpoint, is time efficient. If we target the red zone, we don't have to train as much. Whereas, so if I decide to do, let's say 15 on, 15 off, 30 on, 30 off, 20 on, 10 off, I'm not going to spend an hour doing that, but I might spend an hour doing cardiac output training, or I might spend more time doing lactate threshold training. So in terms of time efficiency, there's a plus to be said for that as well. So again, it depends on how much time you have with your athletes and what the targets are. I suppose I want to say as well that it's not limited to the said factors that I've put in there. So if you have somebody who's unfit and you push them into zone 5, of course you're going to improve their lactate threshold, of course you're going to improve cardiac output, of course you're going to improve a lot of things. But again, there's a rate of return once you get to a certain level with an athlete, and I just wanted to target those main things that'll always be the mainstay. Looking at the other zones then, zone 4 and zone 3, so anaerobic threshold and aerobic thresholds, what do they mean? Well, let's say if we got an athlete to run, so let's say if we're out on a track or on a pitch and say, look, I want you to run laps, and you control the speeds and you decide, okay, look, you're going to run this next lap as fast as you can. And aerobic threshold is pretty much where lactate levels in the blood. People think lactate isn't always present in the blood, but it is generally around 1 millimole per liter of blood. So it's always around because you're always utilizing that system. You never really turn off one system and turn on another. You just have one system maybe taking over from another system, but all systems kind of work together, especially when you get in here into the end, in the interval training part. So aerobic threshold is, let's say your resting lactate levels are 1 millimole. So if you add another millimole, so you're around 2 millimole for aerobic threshold, and you're around 4 for anaerobic. So again, sorry to talk about what's going on up here. The intensity of the training, if it's always low intensity training, so let's say this is a fast walk or whatever, you're kind of going to go below aerobic threshold unless you bring it up to a fast pace. So it's going to be low intensity. Moderate high intensity, again, we'll talk about it as we go through it. You're again starting to utilize muscle fibers and energy systems that are going to produce more lactate. And then once you get up into the high intensity, so anaerobic threshold is basically when there's a sudden spike in the lactate in the blood. So as we talked about, look, 1 millimole above resting and 4 millimoles of lactate at anaerobic threshold. So once you get past here, there's a gradual incline. And then once you get to here, there's a sudden spike. So that's where you start accumulating a lot of lactate, a lot of hydrogen ions. It's kind of, again, to put all the zones in, you can easily just say, look, this is zone 3, this is zone 4, and this is zone 5. Okay, so that's hopefully it's not too technical. I don't think it is. I think it's okay. But again, look, if you've come in late, you can ask me any questions privately on the chat, and I can answer them as I go, because I don't want to be just here talking and nobody really interacting. Because, as I said at the start, I'd rather have a conversation rather than kind of me just talking and nobody saying anything. Okay. So why zone 3 and why zone 4? So most people don't think these zones have much merit, so they don't spend much time in them. They just kind of force the issue and say, okay, we're going to go to red the whole time. But there's benefits in both these zones, and it's probably something that people just don't realize. But obviously, if you're doing more low intensity stuff, low medium intensity, you can do more of that. If you always think of training as zone 5 and really difficult, and you decide you want to train every day, that's just not doable, because you're going to fatigue, you're going to increase your injury risk, and you're not going to get fitter. You're going to spin the wheels in the one position. So zone 3 is very beneficial for increasing training volume. So if you need to increase volume in the legs in terms of if you're a distance athlete, or maybe you're coming back from a long layoff like right now, you're not going to go straight into the red zone, because there's going to be too high a risk. So maybe we go through the lower zones first and introduce the body to the loading and stuff that's going to happen on the training pitch eventually. We can improve cardiac output. What is cardiac output? Stroke volume, basically, multiplied by heartbeats. So it's the capacity of the heart and then how often it's going to beat. So if we don't focus too much on cardiac output, you're looking at poor recovery levels. So let's say somebody who's unfit and spends a lot of time in zone 5, not going to recover very well, whereas somebody who is fit and decides to do more zone 5 training, they'll recover better, so they can train harder in essence. So cardiac output is basically improving the capacity of the heart, specifically the left ventricle. Joe Jameson talks a lot about it. Instead of working with what I would define as a 1 liter engine, we're going to turn it into a 3 liter engine. So if we can increase the capacity of the heart, its ability to produce or to pump blood, then obviously that's hugely beneficial for recovery. And it's hugely beneficial as well, because a 3 liter engine isn't going to have as many revs as a 1 liter engine. So by spending a lot of time in zone 3, you can actually improve what happens in zone 4 and zone 5. As I said, improve recovery, and it's a lower exercise stress. So if somebody's come back from an injury or something like that, you can introduce zone 3 training and say, look, we can't obviously go into the higher thresholds because the body and the joints and the muscle tissue may not be used to it. So we can actually add in exercise that isn't hugely intense but still has huge benefit. Again, I use it for recovery. If we did do high intensity training session, you could say, okay, we're happy enough to go into zone 3 the following day. We could target a heart rate of, for argument's sake, 130 to 150, and say, okay, we'll just get blood into the muscle tissues and use it as a recovery protocol. So again, it's just things people don't utilize a lot. Why zone 4? Increase lactate threshold. So as we talked about, lactate threshold is anaerobic threshold. There's a lot of different terms for it. So you have onset of blood lactate, so OBLA, and anaerobic threshold and lactate threshold, and all these kind of terms, but it's loosely all the same thing. It just came up with different terms. I don't know why. It's quite confusing for a lot of people, but the lactate threshold, if you look at the three determinants of running performance, you have VO2 max, lactate threshold, and running economy. But we already said VO2 max is a ceiling. So if you take Paula Radcliffe, who her VO2 max didn't change from the age she was 17 to when she broke the world record. Her VO2 max didn't change, but her lactate threshold and her running economy did. So again, if we can push the envelope and say, okay, let's get better at, we can push our lactate threshold to a further place, so we're using less energy as we go. Will the adaptation be roughly? Sorry, I just got a question there. That's when you say about working in aerobic at heart rate 130, 150, will the adaptation be roughly the same on either side of the range? Yeah, I like when I target 130 to 150, that's kind of a general target, because again, 220 minus your age is a general predicator for max heart rate. But if you actually test athletes and if you put them up on treadmills for the gold standard, or you do a beep test or whatever test you want to do, I've rarely found that it actually, it's in or around the zone, but it's never exact. And some lads, let's say a fellow who's got a lower max resting heart rate, he's really going to suffer if you're going to bring in zonal training, because you're going to consistently tell him that he's not reaching the levels that you want him to reach, whereas physiologically he may not be able to go there. But the fact that he's trying to get there is beating him up in a big way. So it's important to get right. So when we say 130 to 150, like, again, I talk about Joel Jameson, he calls it dynamic energy control. So if you were doing a 20-minute session at 130 to 150, for the first minute, we might target a heart range of 130 to 140, and for the second, 140 to 150. And again, every second one would have a different target heart rate, because obviously with zone 3 training and below, it's boring. You know, it can be boring depending on what you're doing. But I would say if you're in or around the range, that there's not a big panic. No, I would say unless you're into the orange and into the red, you're not getting the same adaptation. You're not targeting the same muscle tissue, and you're not going to get the benefit that you want out of it. So again, looking at zone 3, I can do zone 3 training up to 5 times a week, probably more, because it's not hugely taxing. So if I wanted to put in target heart range of 130 to 150 after a high intensity training session the day before, if I make that harder than it needs to be, it's no longer a recovery session. It's another beating them up session or beating her up, and it's going to be as beneficial. So if you're in or around the range, again, it's good to get it right, especially if you decide to take it seriously and say, okay, I do want to kind of implement this in. I just, looking at my athletes at the start, there's huge variance in max heart rate, so it's important to get it right. So when I say 130 to 150, that's very general for everyone. I don't think anyone would be in or out of that. Like, so I would say it's fine. It's fine to put that in. Thanks for the question, by the way. Improving lactate shuttle. George Brooks is the man on this one. So George Brooks looks at basically, we'll talk about muscle fibers in the next few slides, but we have different muscle fibers, and we can actually get a certain category of muscle fibers better at utilizing lactate as an energy source, because lactate is an energy source. So I don't know if you've been following me, but over the last few years or whatever, but lactate is not the devil. It's not what people make it out to be. Things are twisting and turning, thankfully, in the right direction. But lactate is just, I think somebody used the analogy, it's just in with the wrong crowd. Hydrogen ions increase. That's probably the biggest indicator of trouble in the muscle in terms of contraction, is hydrogen ions increasing. Lactate is just there along for the ride. It can be utilized. The heart, it's its primary source of fuel. George Brooks, again, just getting back to him, he looks at it as the brain uses it as fuel. Lungs, mainly type 1 muscle fibers, use lactate as fuel. So it's not a bad thing, and it's not, when people say, oh, I have, they get up in the morning after a tough session, they say, oh, I still have lactate in the system. You don't, it's gone after about 30 to 45 minutes, it's gone. And the soreness that you experience is not lactic acid, it's not any of that. It's a complete, it's just a bad rap it's getting, but it's slowly turning around. But if you want to improve lactate shuttle, it basically means that you're getting the type 1 muscle fibers to utilize energy better. So it'll just clear lactate from the system better. I'll talk about it more as we go. Improve power. Again, we talked about that. If I can improve my lactate threshold, I'm on a bike, let's say I'm going at a certain amount of power or whatever it is. If I improve my lactate threshold, I'll see an improvement in power while maintaining my lactate threshold. So if I improve my fitness, I can obviously have, I can get better numbers on a bike or wherever I'm recording them on, while my heart rate can stay the same. So that's obviously an improvement in fitness. So that's kind of what we're targeting, to say, okay, look, we're getting the athlete into a more difficult training exercise by adding resistance or adding intensity or adding reps or decreasing rest, and they're actually adapting well to it. So that's obviously going to happen after you get them fitter. There's going to be a nice improvement in power. And again, just to emphasize at the bottom, it's not limited to the said factors. It's, again, depending on the level of the athlete you have, you could be improving all of these things. Okay. Excuse me. Muscle fiber types, yeah, so we just touched on it. Type 1s, so we've got 3 basically to go into. So type 1s are aerobic, they're resistant to fatigue, slow contraction times, that's why they're a slow twitch. They contract slower than fast twitch. So as a consequence, because they're slow twitch, slow contraction, they produce low force. And their byproducts are basically carbon dioxide, water, and heat. So if I go out for a jog and I spend time in a certain zone, I may not be producing a lot of lactate. I may not be producing a lot of hydrogen ions and ADP and all the rest of it, because I'm just using my type 1 muscle fibers. Okay. Type 2As, fast twitch oxidative. So these are different terms again. Rather than having one term for everything, they've put loads of terms on loads of things, but they can be aerobic and anaerobic. Their resistance to fatigue is better than type 2Xs, but not as good as type 1s. And because they're faster twitch, they're able to produce higher force. Their byproduct is lactate, and I suppose that's important to consider. Their byproduct is lactate, so when they're utilizing energy, once they've utilized energy, they produce lactate off that. Okay, and again, this is the evil twin or whatever of lactate, the hydrogen ions. So they're going to come along for the ride as well, or the other one is coming along for the ride with the other one, whichever way it goes. And type 2X, fast twitch glycolytic, so anaerobic, so they work, anaerobic basically means working without oxygen. That doesn't mean that there is no oxygen present, it just means that they work without it. They're prone to fatigue, so they produce a lot of force because they're fast twitch, which means they have a rapid contraction. Excuse me. But they're prone to fatigue, so that if you decide, for argument's sake, you're going to do a sprint Usain Bolt style, about 9.69 or whatever it is, if somebody wants to correct me, you can work away. You're going to be hopefully utilizing a lot of these. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do it because these fellas aren't going to produce enough force. So you're going to be predominantly a fast twitch athlete. So that was the thing with Usain Bolt. Obviously, we don't have a predetermined amount, or not a predetermined percentage of fibers, but genetics do help. So he was obviously fast twitchy. He was a twitchy athlete, type 2As, type 2Xs, and as a consequence, if he runs his 9.63s or 9.69s, whatever he did was world record, he's not going to rest for 30 seconds and repeat that. They're going to take a long time to recover from that. Jeepers, a run like that could take maybe days to recover from. Okay, why is all this important? Why are we talking about muscle fiber types? This particular paper, which probably one of my favorite papers that I've read, it's Training Fast Twitch Fibers by, don't ask me to pronounce the name, Maglicio maybe? Ernest Maglicio. So it's called Training Fast Twitch Fibers, and he predominantly works with swimmers himself and Jan Albrecht, who wrote a book there that I'll be recommending at the end. So what he did was increase the intensity of the swim, and then they looked at what fibers were activated to depending on how fast the swimmers were going. So again, he said, look, at aerobic threshold, we're predominantly using slow twitch fibers, which makes sense because we can do a lot of that training. These particular fibers are, again, aerobic. They're resistant to fatigue, so it's probably going to be aerobic threshold. But once you get into anaerobic threshold levels or lactate threshold levels or OBLA or whatever you want to call it, obviously you've more lactate in the blood because you've started to utilize more fast twitch fibers, and their byproduct is lactate. So lactate is coming from these fibers. So once you've brought up the intensity, it's because you've recruited these fibers more, and then obviously there's more lactate in the blood. So that all makes sense. So if you were to look at it and say, okay, well, I want to target specifically my type 2 X's or my fast twitch X's, you're not going to really do it at aerobic threshold and anaerobic threshold. So if you're dealing with a team sport, you're going to get a certain fitness level done with players and athletes, but you're not going to get to the level required to train fast twitch X, for argument's sake. Now, I could do a completely different presentation on the consequences of training in that, and the fact that these are one of the first fibers to change. Actually, these can change into these, and these can change into these, but that's probably a presentation for another day. But it's just important to note that depending on what type of fibers you want to target, that'll also determine which zones you want to train in. And again, this paper, it's Training Fast Twitch Fibers by Ernest McLeish. Okay, it's a good paper, it's a good review. So again, to come back to the original one, check the time, I didn't want to go over half an hour. Ooh, okay, 35 minutes, not too bad. What's the difference between these two? Well, we know this athlete spent a lot of time in the red zone. Now, as I'm looking at it, unless anyone wants to have their thoughts on it, which I'm open to, I personally, obviously, look, I've experience with these athletes, so I know if this is a normal day for this particular individual or if it's not. But the thing that ring alarm bells for me as I'm looking at it is he just didn't recover as well as this particular individual. So he never really got into the grey zone. He never got in there at all. Now, the backlog of the whole thing is, look, he arrived late to training. He's got a stressful job, blah, blah, blah. All these things are going to have a huge impact, and you need to know your athletes, and you need to have a kind of a database to choose from to say, okay, this isn't normal for this particular individual. Because obviously that's going to affect heart rate as well. And again, that's probably another presentation I could do on heart rate variability. But if I was looking at it, someone might say that he needs to train more in the red zone in order to resemble what's going on with this fellow. Whereas I would say, well, I know him pretty well. He doesn't normally get up to these levels. So in hindsight, we could say, look, he had a stressful day. That's obviously going to have an impact. Should I pull him from the session? Possibly. It could be a higher injury risk because he's spending more time in red than this particular individual. They're doing the same training session, but this individual is only spending 6.5 minutes in red, and this one's spending over double that. So maybe he should be pulled because he's an injury risk. But I would look at it and say, look, he's just not recovering as well. That particular day, he just didn't recover as well. He never got back into the grey zone. So you could argue that maybe if he did more of his zone 4 or zone 3, his recovery would be better, because when we train at lactate threshold, we're teaching the body to utilize lactate as an energy source. So if we flood the system with lactate and we haven't really trained the system to get rid of it, we've only trained it to get up to that level and maintain that level, well, then maybe we should say, okay, well, for argument's sake, we could put in a bit more of the other training, and then you can get better at clearing it and getting the heart rate down. But you could look at it and say running economy as well. Maybe this fella's got a better running economy, so it's not costing as much energy. I suppose the big thing for me as well, what I'm looking at it as, these weren't predetermined drills. These weren't like 15 on, 15 off. This wasn't mass. This wasn't anything like that. These were just hurling drills. I just sat back and watched. I had the iPad in front of me and just watched what was going on. And the other arguments, of course, is that you could say, well, maybe the drills just weren't difficult for this fellow because he's just that fit that maybe the intensity he needed to go to just wasn't in the drill. Or you could argue that the drill itself wasn't that fatiguing. And maybe the drill needs to be brought in, maybe add in a tougher element, like decrease the resting times for this fella if the target is indeed to spend more time in the red. But again, if anyone wants to chime in on that, feel free. You can chat away there on that, or you can private chat me on that one. But look, in hindsight, I know both individuals, and I know what a good day for one is and what a bad day for one is. So that's pretty much the way I would have taken it. Said, okay, look, maybe we should have pulled this fella from the session earlier. Maybe if we had had a chat with him and he'd told me beforehand, because you very rarely get told these things beforehand, that he'd just come from work and he had a stressful day and he was going to be late and all the rest of it. That's obviously going to have an effect on heart rate recovery. And again, I could probably do another presentation on heart rate variability and how all that things in. How long would you want someone to be in the red for a typical hour session? If you look at Martin Boucher's stuff with HIIT training and his book, HIIT Training with Paul Larson, their kind of recommendation for improving fitness is around 10 minutes in the red zone and around 7 minutes in the red zone to maintain fitness. So I've been trying to find research out there where, like, I haven't found a paper that literally says you need to spend this much time in the red zone. Like, even in Martin Boucher's paper, he refers to a paper that he wrote that actually doesn't say anything in it as to where he gets 10 minutes from and where he gets 7 minutes from. He just put it in there, and then whatever. If you ever read Martin Boucher's work, 95% of the what do they call the references are all his work. So that'd be a nice scenario to be in, obviously. But I don't know. I suppose the honest answer for me is, if I was trying to get somebody fitter, I'd try and target 10 minutes in the red. And if I was trying to maintain that fitness, I'd target 7 minutes. But in saying all that, if you have an individual, let's say I did a specific test with BlackRock, because the crest is there, put enough to that. I mean, one of our lads got to 22.5 in the 30-15 intermittent fitness test, which is the one I use. And the argument, of course, is that, if you get him to 23, he'll be some hurler. And yeah, but if I try and get him to 23, he's going to have to go through a lot to get that, because he's got to cover more ground. He's got to do more accels, more decels. I mean, how fit does an individual have to be if they're playing the game? He only has to be fit for the game he's playing. He doesn't have to be fit for anything else. Not going playing for Chelsea or anything, or Man United or whatever. You have, and that's why I suppose I target as well a lot of small-sided games in our conditioning with teams I'm involved with. I only do the mass stuff and all that stuff. I don't do mass, but I only do certain conditioning stuff because I think that this particular individual or this particular team need to get to a certain fitness level, because I know the training sessions that I'm prescribing after this need to be played at a certain intensity. So to come back to it, how long would I want to be somebody in the red? If I'm doing a drill and I'm specifically targeting time in red, I'll look at, based on Martin Boucher and Paul Larson stuff, 10 minutes in the red and 7 minutes in the red for maintaining fitness. How come the player that spent longer in the red zones, max heart rate was lower than the other? Yeah, it's another good question, because why are certain individuals' max heart rates not meeting others? The honest answer is I don't know. We did a fitness test. We did the 30-15. We looked at the way the heart rates were going. The lads knew that they were going to see this increment, obviously, on their heart rate monitors. And if anyone finished in the orange zone or the green zone, I'd be having questions over there. Listen, you didn't push yourself that hard. So the lads did push themselves. And based on the numbers that particular individual got in the fitness test, I'm still not sure. You could argue that his heart, the capacity of his heart is huge, and that he doesn't have to it doesn't have to pump as fast, because he might have a capacity in his heart that's very large. Like, I mean, that's the big difference between endurance athletes and somebody who's not training. The capacity of their hearts are huge. Left ventricles and resting heart rate actually itself is a good indicator of capacity, heart ventricle capacity. So I think Lance Armstrong was somewhere in the low 30s, mid 30s, and obviously he was doing vitamins and minerals. But I think there was a story he went to hospital, and whoever went with him now, God only knows. But your man had to inform the doctor, no, that's his resting heart rate. Don't be panicking, because obviously the doctor thought it was very unusual, but they've got a massive capacity in their hearts. So the argument could be, why isn't it there? I don't know. I haven't seen any papers that have said that if you increase your max heart rate, your fitness improves. I don't know. I haven't seen papers on that. I've only seen papers that move VO2 max, lactate threshold, cardiac output. And as I said, predeterminants of elite athletes is lactate threshold, VO2 max, and running economy. So I don't know would be the answer. Sorry. Do you think the variance would or could be down to skill level of that player or pressure on that player to perform? Yes. That's also a good question, in that the particular intensity of, like, that's the big thing when people, let's say I was involved with Cork for 3 years, and people always talked about, the next level is that intensity is high. So that's the big difference. You don't cover more ground, it's just you cover more high intense ground, so the intensity is higher. So maybe this particular individual, for his position, maybe the drill didn't suit him, so maybe that's why it went up. There's a lot of things at play, and I suppose just experience, you saying, okay, look, I know this guy, he's not unfit, I know his numbers that he got in this particular test, I've seen him on the pitch, he doesn't struggle in the end of the second half or anything. And again, it's just having a relationship with the player, and again, just accumulating data, kind of saying, not being so hesitant as to say, you see people going out and offering these packages where they'll do live heart rate for one match. They'll piss off, then they come back 6 weeks later and do another one. You're like, what are you going to learn? Like, you're going to learn nothing. You're going to tell a fella that, no, your heart rates are all over the place. Based on what? It's just, you have to know the player. Why don't I do mass running? I don't do mass running because I just find the VIFT, Martin Bichet's kind of stuff, better because of what's the term I'm thinking of? Anaerobic speed reserve. So again, Bichet, I like his stuff, not all of it, but some of it, well, most of it. And if you predict off MAS, like they saw that if you did a run and let's say they got whatever they got in the MAS, you put everybody into boxes, then you, whatever you say, you're in this zone and you're in this, not training zones now, these are just cones. So based on what they got in their MAS score, that wasn't enough. That's, you could have a fella who did, let's say, the 12K time or a Cooper test or Bronco or whatever he did, and he ran it, and this is the result he got. He said that didn't seem to correlate with how intense the running was. Whereas I just looked at the data on the IFT scores and said, actually, this seems to be better. Now again, Martin Bichet could be biased with it, but I've seen good results from that. So I've gone with that instead. Just again, it's a personal thing. I know everyone's doing MAS, and it obviously works for a lot of individuals, but that doesn't mean it works for every individual. So I just decided to think outside the box. We would often look at meters per minute thresholds from our GPS data when the small sided game to determine work rate, intensity. Have you used zonal training to measure against this? When we did the small sided games, we last year, maybe the year before, maybe last year. Last year, I got GPS units from a friend of mine who was involved in one of the professional rugby teams in Ireland, and he came down and I said, look, I'm worried that the intensities that we're doing in these small-sided games are too high, and we might have had, I think we had maybe 2 or 3 hamstring injuries within a few weeks. So I said, okay, the papers, the danger when you're looking at papers is always that it's always short-term. There's very few long-term. So if you, Shane Malone particularly, and I'm good friends with Shane, like he's done a lot of research behind the small-sided games, but they're always like over 6 to 8 weeks, and 6 to 8 weeks is great. You see huge improvements. And even Tabata, I think, what's he do? Is it 12 weeks or something like that, 10 weeks? But if you did it for 6 months, like which a lot of people do with their training, they just say, oh, I just have to go harder and harder and harder. There is a risk. Like there is a time where you're going to say, right, the body's given up now. It's had enough of this kind of stuff. So anyway, to get back to the question, sorry, with regards to work rate and intensity, we looked at the GPS data, and the particular games we were doing were kind of based off of basically a backs and forwards game with restricted numbers and ball constantly coming in and things like that. So the intensities were huge. Like they were probably too big. They were too big because we cut the time spent playing the games afterwards after we got the data back. So I'd love to have GPS data and all that stuff, and it would be great. I'd love to see it, but I don't have that. And will I ever have it? I don't know. And I'd love to have it, and I probably would look at work rate intensity, but right now I have to base it off what I'm reading in scientific papers and say, okay, what do I have? And again, I would look at, we play with BlackRock, we train with the heart rate monitors on, and if, let's say, the hurling drills get the lads to where I want them to get to, I don't put in loads of running drills at the end. And so I say, look, we spent enough time in the red zone that I'm happy enough that we're going to get a fitness adaptation out of that. Or in the past, maybe I'd come in and we did unconditioning drills no matter what happened. And that's hard to do because nothing is consistent. Lads could show up with 2 hours sleep the night before, having taken in a hot chicken roll the whole day, and that's going to show up. Luckily, it'll show up on a heart rate monitor data. I say, okay, look, these lads are getting beaten up. I'm not going to do any conditioning. We'll just do these drills. We'll cut the time they're being done for, and we'll increase the rest period and stuff like that. But I would love to. I would love to have GPS data and everything just to cement it. But if I had to choose GPS or heart rate monitoring, I choose heart rate monitoring all day. Is there an ideal amount of time per session you would spend in zone 4 to increase lactate threshold? Can spend anywhere from if you look at Steve Magnus's work, he looks at 15 to 25, Joe Jameson probably up to 30 minutes. It is considered not high intensity, but it's certainly not a cakewalk either. So it would be down to the individual, really. It's hard to get it right, and it's very hard to get it right in a running setting. It's easier on a bike or on a cross trainer or something like that, because you control tempos a lot easier than if you're running and if you're going down a hill or up a hill, or you're against the wind, or the surface that you're on, or the state that you're in terms of rest and recovery and stuff like that. That'll all affect heart rate. So I would look at spending ideally lactate threshold minimum 30 minutes anyway. Well, sorry, minimum 15 up to 30, and then maybe above, depending on the need of the individual. What are my thoughts on tempo running? Yeah, I love it. I love tempo running. We do it. We do it a lot. We do. Sorry, there's just another question going in there. We do tempo running. Yeah, we do it in preseason, and we just it's useful for getting players exposed to not max sprints, but in or around, just getting the body and the muscles and the joints used to kind of the speed. I look at it a kind of, just based off the heart rate monitors, we look at it a kind of like lactate threshold training. Just because you're at an intensity of 85%, the heart rate monitors have come back and the lads spend a lot of time in the orange. So I'm happy. I'm happy with that. So yeah, we use tempo running all the time, if I'm honest. What was that question? What was the question that I was asked? But sorry, one of the questions was about just meters per minute thresholds with GPS data in a small sided game to determine work rate and intensity. And the question was, have you used zonal training to measure against this? I haven't used it against GPS, but I have used GPS. And that was it. Would I have a target rest and heart rate you want players to get to? Ideally, we actually utilize it at the start of the season. We get everyone to lie down on the floor. There's good research behind it, and actually we just do a 3-minute test, so they just lie down on the floor for 3 minutes. We get resting heart rates. I'd like lads to be in high 40s, low 50s, ideally. That'll depend on the individual, of course, but if you get somebody who's in 65, it's going to take longer to get down to. It might take longer than they should to get down to the heart rate you need them to be, but I'd like to think lads will be at high 40s, low 50s minimum. There's other things you can utilize. You can look at heart rates. Let's say if we went out onto the pitch, did a warm up and incorporated a kind of a predicted drill in that they would run. So let's say they did 100 meters. So I'd say, okay, look, I want you to get to the 100 meters in whatever it's going to be. I don't know. I'm not even going to spitball a figure here. But it's the lad should be able to talk and stuff like that. And it's just a test to say, okay, if you can get out to here and back, and the resting or the heart rates are at a level that, okay, it's fine. I mean, personally, we use CMJ testing, but it's a handy one to use for fitness. Is that you can do this kind of sub-max running as part of a warm-up. It takes about 4 minutes. And you say, okay, just go out there and back, lads out there and back, chat away to yourselves, and see, okay, have we seen lads here in the orange before we've even started? And say, okay, we're going to have to address that. So maybe he's in the orange on a really easy drill, and his CMJ numbers are low. It's probably time to have a conversation with him then and say, look, what's going on? I think we're nearly coming to the end, lads. Oh yeah, just do summary zone 3, why we spend time in zone 3, zone 4, zone 5. I can't emphasize enough the bottom down here, lads, not limited to only set factors, depending on the individual. The only addition I have here is concentric cardiac hypertrophy. So talked briefly about cardiac output. So cardiac output is basically increasing the capacity of the heart. So again, changing it from a 1 litre engine to a 3 litre engine. But what happens if you spend a lot of time in zone 5? What happens with regards to the heart? Well, it thickens. So the heart walls thicken, and you're not getting the same adaptation that you would get if you did a lot of cardiac output training. So if everything's really high intense, obviously the heart has to get stronger, pumping blood out. So the heart walls thicken because it has to get stronger. Whereas if you utilize cardiac output training at the start and say, oh, look, if we increase the capacity, yes, we can go into zone 5 later and increase the thickness. But if we're always just increasing the thickness, we're not going to get better at recovery. So that's what concentric cardiac hypertrophy is. Cardiac output stuff is eccentric cardiac hypertrophy. So eccentric just means you got to imagine the heart like a balloon. And if you're training at a level that there's a large amount of blood going into the heart, and then the heart's allowed to pump it out, well, then it's going to expand. Whereas if you're constantly in zone 5 and it's just constantly beating and beating and beating and beating, it's not going to have that time to take in a lot of blood to pump out blood, because it's trying to get oxygen to the muscle tissues, and it's just saying just pump out blood, pump out blood. So it just taking sort of different adaptation for the heart. And again, look, the presentation isn't about what happens kind of on a local muscular level as such. It's specifically focusing on heart rate. So that's why we've not gone into a lot of detail on some things, but I said I'd add that in as well anyway, just to kind of say, look, this happens the heart, it's zone 5, and this happens the heart, it's zone 3. My recommended readings are there, lads, if you were interested, where I got some of the stuff from. These are all books, obviously, at the top, very good books, all come up with different things. Some of them are heavier in terms of details than others, but any of them, pick any of them or pick 2 of them. Don't think you would go far wrong. I would, of all of it, if you don't want to go into the science too much and you kind of looking more at psychological, I definitely recommend Endure at the bottom there by Alex Hutchinson. It's just, it'll make you think differently about everything in terms of endurance and what people think it is and what it actually is. And then if you kind of want to start getting into a bit more science behind it, ultimate MMA conditioning, and then the heavier science is definitely adaptation and sports training. Okay, and then the websites at the bottom as well I definitely recommend Lyle McDonald behind these, so Joel Jameson and the lads as well, and lactate.com, very good. Is there any other questions, lads? Excuse me. No questions. Does anyone, kind of conscious of the time, so I'm trying to stay 40 minutes, but it's not been 40, has it? If there's no questions, lads, we might put a pin in it. Which zone, oh, wait, sorry. Which zone is best for fat loss and muscle gain? Is that a serious question? Maybe it is. Which zone is best for fat loss? I don't think you can target one zone. I mean, if you look at HIIT training, which is all zone 5 stuff really, and spending as much time in zone 5 as possible in a lot of cases, depending on, again, percentages in mass and IFT and things like that. the best thing for fat loss and muscle gain is obviously going to be calorie control for starters, and then quality of calories. And if you're looking at how you're obviously going to burn more calories at a high intensity than you would at a lower or medium intensity because you're not using as much energy. So ultimately, zone 5 is best for fat loss and muscle gain. That would be again, fat loss. Best thing for fat loss is nutrition, and I think people look at training as a way to control body composition, and yes, but it's a very, very small part of it. I mean, if you're taking in 3,000 calories a day, you could bring in 5 HIIT training sessions and you might still not lose that much body fat. So calorie control is where body fat comes from, and muscle gain is going to come from quality of calories in terms of protein intake, and obviously doing hypertrophy training and things like that. But if I had to pin my flag to the mast or whatever, HIIT training, zone 5, short periods, just it's higher intensity, so it's burning more calories. So for that reason, I'd pick that. Any thoughts on zone 2 recovery runs for GA players? Again, it depends on the zone. So when we talked about back in the starting slides, everyone's definition of zone 2 is different. In the one we did, I think it was 70 to 60. Yes, there's benefits. I mean, when we're doing recovery runs, what we're trying to do is get blood to the joints and tissues without creating a lot of stuff. So if we do zone 2, you're obviously going to be predominantly sending blood to slow twitch because of what we talked about. So slow twitch fibers are getting blood, so that's great. If you look at Joel Jamieson stuff on high intensity continuous kind of runs, you have to go on a bike at a high intensity and maintain that high intensity. So it's essentially lactate threshold, but it's good for recovery because you're now getting blood into the type 2s. So yes, zone 2 is good for recovery. But there's no danger of going to zone 3 either. So bang for your buck, I'd probably go zone 3. Again, depending on what kind of zones you have identified. I picked zone 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 because that's what Garmin and Polar and Fitbit and all the rest of them work off. Now, in fairness to Polar, especially Polar team, in the last 2 weeks, they've just done an update on the software where you can actually manipulate the zones you want to use. So you can say, oh, look, actually my zone 5 or my red zone is going to be 95 to 100% and not 90 to 100%, because going back to Shane Malone's paper, they targeted heart rate 95% plus. They said, look, 95% plus seemed what to get the players fitter, and not necessarily 90 to 95. Whereas I've kind of taken a holistic approach and said, look, red zone is 90 to 100. But if you want to go after that kind of science, then you're saying, okay, red zone is 95. So, yeah. A couple of questions in the open group. Oh no, sorry. Okay. Do I have a monitor? Oh, okay, I've seen it. Sorry. Just 2 seconds. A couple of questions in the open group chat. Yeah, I must go into that. Now I'm showing my knowledge in Zoom. This is the problem. Do you have a monitoring prescription use for the 3-minute resting heart rate test at the beginning of the season, or is it a gauge on who sits where for yourself? Well, the important thing, I suppose, with any test is that it's reproducible. So with my lads, we just lie on the floor. They just lie on the floor and close their eyes, and all we say to them is just try and get your heart rate as low as possible. So, well, we don't say that obviously because that probably throw it up there, but you'd say, look, lads, just relax 3 minutes. And that's the repeatable one that I do. Others do it seating, and if you're doing it standing, any test is fine as long as it's reproducible. So if you want to do standing all the time, getting back to what I said at the start with regard the actual kind of these things, the smartwatches, sometimes they're reliably unreliable. So they're always out, but they're always out by the same thing. So that in a way is reliable. So if you're going to use a standing test, you might not get a true representation of resting heart rate because they're standing. So they might be, I don't know, well, whatever. It might not be as relaxing as lying down. So, but as long as you say, okay, well, look, their resting heart rate according to the standing is is this, and we test off that. So if you get a number of 60 and the next time you test it's 55, obviously it's benefited, whatever training has benefited them. So the test stands the test. But I myself just use lying down, because if you get 25, 30 lads standing up, they'll chat to each other. And nobody will close their eyes, because nobody wants to see somebody else with their eyes closed. Whereas if everyone's lying down, staring at the ceiling, because we do it indoors, obviously, people switch off easier. With regards to regaining fitness after a short period of G-training, such as a week for a high-volume endurance athlete, on returning to training, would it be better to train at the correct heart rate zone, even though your heart rate would be much higher for a similar power output, due to training at a similar power output that you were training at before the detraining period, but now at a much higher heart rate for the same power? That's a long sentence. Regards to regaining fitness after a short period of detraining, such as a week. A short period of detraining, a week won't do much. And a lot of people think as well that when you've done a certain amount of detraining, that you've lost fitness. And to a certain extent, that might be true. But if you're a fit individual, and first of all, if you're a fit individual who has got this, like what I would use as a massive amount of cash in the bank. So if you're a fit individual who has a huge amount of cash in the bank, so they've done the work, like they've been training for 3 or 4 years, that fitness won't go so fast. But if you're a fit individual because you've done loads of HIIT training for 4 weeks and suddenly you've seen, like, the faster you get fitter, the faster you lose it. So if you've amassed this huge amount of training volume, you'll maintain that pretty easily, especially after a week. So I wouldn't be panicking too much. And even if you've lost it, studies show that you regain it back faster. You regain it back no problems, especially after a week. So I suppose that'd be the best way to answer that question. A week I wouldn't panic about at all. Sometimes, and again, probably a slide for another day, you might actually come back fitter, depending on how, if your training has been brutal and maybe that's why you took a week off, you'll actually come back fitter because you've just beaten yourself up. So a lot of times when lads are training, they beat themselves so far down that they misinterpret a lack. Let's say they think, oh, I'm not fit, or I need to train harder. Whereas if you looked at the way they're training, you could say, actually, if you took a week off, you'll come back fitter, because your body just hasn't adapted to the amount of high intensity training you're doing. So if you leave it adapt, again, the supercompensation theory isn't the word, but because it's not a theory, it's more or less fact, that you have to allow the body to adapt. And that's why I would always say, look, training hard is great, but recovering hard is just as important. So yeah, that would be my short answer to that question. Do I use live heart rate readings for recovery time between drills during sessions? I used to, I don't anymore. So 3 years ago, I suppose, I started introducing heart rate training, and we would have done alactic interval work. So we would have done maybe a 5 or 6 or a 10-second sprint, and then line the lads up, and only the lads who got their heart rate back between 140 and 160 were allowed to sprint again. I think there's some errors in it. I know Simply Faster, there's an article there probably this week on it, and said it's not valid because you don't do that in the sport, but you don't do tempo runs in the sport either. You know, you don't do cardiac output training in the sport. You don't do a lot of things. You don't stretch in the middle of a game either, you know, but all these things are still part of a training process. So I think if you've done your research and you're kind of, you know, I actually think this is valid, then it's up to you whether to go with it. Would I do it again? Depending on the time period, I might do it again, depending on the athlete. I think, again, a lot of times when you're training with people, it's the people you're training with, you have to gauge them. You could have a different culture that these lads are used to, a certain way of training, and if you decide to just pull the rug from under that, that can have a cultural backlash as well. And even though you mightn't believe in it, the way they're training, you can't, as I heard about recently, like it's like a big massive ship. Like when you go into a club, you can't suddenly steer the ship the other way. You have to just gradually turn it. Like, say with an ocean liner, you're not going to do donuts with an ocean liner. You can only steer it a certain way, like, and hopefully then you bring them in the right direction. But again, I'm probably elaborating on that too much. Publicly. Sorry, I'll just check. Is that all? I think that's all the questions, lads, is it? Unless I'm really showing up my ineptitude now at Zoom, which is possible too, of course. One meeting. Yeah, I think that's it, lads. Are we good? I think we're good. I think we're good. What I'll do, lads, unless anyone wants to ask a question there in the next 2 minutes, but again, I'll probably go back to this. Sorry, this slide here. Look, I'll send on the slides anyway, so you don't really need to write them down. But what I would ask is that, lads, I'll be putting in a survey. Perfect, yeah. I'll be putting in a survey. I'll be sending that out on an email. So if you could it's just a 5-question survey. Literally tap, 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 tap. I made sure to do that. You don't have to do any writing. You don't have to do anything. If you just fill that in for me, I'd be delighted with that. And I'll attach the slides with it as well. Okay. I said I'd have a cup of tea if it was going well, and I said I'd have a bottle of Miller if it was going badly. So I think I'll finish my tea. All right, lads. If you want to send on, look, if you want to contact me as well with regards, email, I'm here. If you have any questions, work away on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and all the rest of it. All right, lads.
Thanks, Stephen.
Cheers, lads. Cheers, Ar. We'll be in touch, all right?
Okay.
Cheers, lads. Yeah. See you, lads.